So it's very nice. We're in competition with other people, so it's very nice to have you here. It's interesting because, machine learning, AI covers also many things in operations research, and timetabling is something that is quite, normal as an optimization problem. But maybe we'll have to focus on that in the future. So I want to talk about data sharing, right? So we know it's a big issue. We want to do a lot of AI. To do AI machine learning, you want data, and typically people don't want to share data. So we've been investing into a lot of different things. So actually with George, we had a new project called Smart for Us, where one of the work packages that I led was focused on data sharing and how we rethink business models from the, does that make sense, to how we make it happen in practice, right? What would be the IT infrastructure, etc. So I want to give you a bit of an overview. It's totally non-technical. There's no equation, nothing. I just want to discuss where we see interest in data sharing and where we see challenges. Yeah, I have a few affiliations. Manuele didn't mention it. I'm also a chief scientist at a company in Denmark that's called AFSpace, and I have what do you call that, affiliated professorship at DTU in Denmark. They would be upset if I don't say it. All right, so we're going to talk about digitalization, the use of data, and some of the recent development. I guess some of you must have followed. Data sharing actually is a very important topic lately. From people in academia trying to develop solutions to people in government and regulation trying to push that forward. So that's what I want to discuss. The thing is that many of us, for instance, have been obsessed with data science. We're going to have some cool project, help industry, and we often only focus on this block, right? Just the data and putting a machine learning layer. While there's a very important component also with ICT and computing. So for instance, the more we do machine learning, the more we have computing, and the more we impact the environment, which goes against the original idea to help with renewables, right? So we have to think these three together. Then it's the same with power and energy. How many of you work with power and energy as an application? Not so many, actually. So I have a bit of room to explain that. If you think, it's a very, very big caricature, right? There's only the system, so think of it of all these cables, all the assets on the way. There's generation, so wind turbines, solar panels, conventional power plants, hydro dams, etc. And there's the demand, right? We oversimplify. When we started with data, doing some analytics, machine learning, etc., we could see a lot of benefits by focusing on one of these things, in isolation. So you can do a lot of asset management for the system. You can do, some NILM for the demand, try to detect appliances, etc. For the generation, we did forecasting for renewables. But actually, the really fun stuff is when you look at the interaction. The real value of data is at the interaction between these things. So there are many problems today where machine learning is coming into play that are in between the system and generation, in between the demand and the system, and in between the generation and the demand. That goes from technical focus to business models, right? The new business models for retailers of the future, they would be at the interface between these guys also, right? So already here, the fact that we make all these arrows and we say there's data involved, that smells like we want people to share data, right? Or data should be available by different stakeholders. So by design, we need some data sharing. That's pretty obvious. Cool. But now what are we going to use the data for? So I guess you all do machine learning then, or data science or something related if you're not into power and energy. At least one of the two, right? We agree? I expect that. Cool. So we all love data, and for power and energy, there's been a funny thing. I would say for the last 15 years, we've all rushed, always we want more data, so it's like the rush for gold, right? And we end up with a situation that at the end of the day, we've been collecting a lot of data, the data is not usable, or we don't even remember why we wanted to collect this data in the first place, right? And we also see this idea of data sharing maybe as a way, also a framework, to talk and try to be a bit smarter. Why do we need this data in the first place? Okay, it's going to cost us a lot of money and we have to be jointly in that, so maybe we have to agree beforehand where it's going to go. And I have a few examples for you. So one, it's smart meters, right? I don't know the situation in Switzerland, so please bear with me. I know the situation in France, in the UK, in Denmark. We've been pushing for smart meters, saying we're going to collect a lot of data and we're going to do, we can solve all problems with the smart metering data afterwards. But then, for instance, in Denmark, we started some projects about peer-to-peer trading or demand response management. And then I have very, very easy specification. I need data at the minute resolution. But then the people who design and deploy the smart meters, like, well, you cannot get that. And anyway, you would get the data with 24 hours delay, so you cannot use it in a control loop with feedback in near real time. So we rush for collecting this data, but we never actually look at all the purposes we need it. It's mainly used for settlement eventually. And we could find a few applications, and it's going to change, we know. But in the first go, it's one of the cases where we rushed for collecting data, but maybe it was not completely thought through, right? Another fun case was a very large project in Denmark, in Copenhagen. There's this new neighborhood called Nordhavn, where we could have access to, for instance, this building. I was getting so much data from the last 6 floors, heating, windows, water demand, light, activity sensors, everything you want. We're talking about several tens thousand of data streams, right? And then, so it was super expensive, by the way. I don't know how much it has cost. And then they told me, okay, Pierre, what do you do with this data? I was, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And then we can share this data. No, the data cannot be shared. Okay, but then we have to erase a lot of applications. And then eventually we selected 100 data streams out of 10,000, right? But they had deployed everything, and we paid the bill for collecting 10,000 data streams. There may be applications in the future. I'm not saying we've been completely idiotic, but still it feels, we've been shooting before to understand what we really needed. And again, there was a big issue with sharing, is that a lot of this data being collected, if shared, would be very useful, but people didn't want to share. Classical problem. Okay, but so how do we make an impact with data? So that's where it's much more ML focused now. When I teach my students, we do, classical descriptive, predictive, prescriptive analytics. And we have very nice cases with power and energy system. Have you seen this electricity map thing? So some of you have, maybe not everybody. It starts from a very silly idea. If we want people to be better at understanding, how we pollute by consuming energy, they should see it. They should see in real time how clean or dirty the energy you consume is. So this former student and colleague, Olivier, started this thing, electricity map. Now they have 1 million visitors per month. Emmanuel Macron mentions them when he goes on TV. And they have this setup where they don't have all the countries in the world, but the biggest part of the work for them has been to convince the different operators of system to plug somehow their data streams into this platform for proposing this kind of visualization to people. So it's a descriptive analytics project, but behind there's a big job in how we convince people to share data. We are very lucky here because politicians, regulators are pushing for that. So normally all system operators throughout the world have an incentive, or they are being pushed to share this data. So that's cool, that helps. Another case is forecasting. So George and I, we've done a lot of forecasting with wind, for instance. And something that has always annoyed me is that we always believe forecasting eventually is a commercial thing, right? There's going to be proprietary data, there's going to be a business, right? I don't even know how people, how much they charge for forecasting. But if you're smart, there's so much data out there, you can build a completely open system that does forecasting with state-of-the-art performance level. So I gave that as a challenge to one of my students at Imperial College last year. And she actually, in less than 3 months, developed, it's still online, teraki.com. It's a fully open access forecasting platform for wind. It's self-maintaining, even I don't understand how she did it to make it so cheap and reliable. But just to say, if you find the right way to plug data streams, something like forecasting that's obviously generating a lot of revenues for commercial vendors can also be done in a very open and cheap way. And then the final case is prescriptive analytics. So it's not out there so much. I think there's a lot of, I'd say, challenges and fears with using prescriptive analytics with power and energy systems. But we're lucky enough that some of the big players like RT are pushing for it, right? They want to see in the control room of the future, are we going to have much more of this AI that just suggests a decision, but how do we have trust? How do we make it transparent, etc.? And there again, in the background, there's a lot of data sharing. How are we going to get people to provide all the data to help with trust, for instance? Because if we have a clearer view and we can have consensus on what's happening based on the data of everybody, we can bring some trust into this prescriptive analytics. So just to say, if you look at these three, descriptive, predictive, prescriptive, there's going to be a very big component of data sharing in the future in there. All right, so what's the European situation and the recent developments? If you have opinions, please share after when we have the questions. I would say, don't quote me, but it's recorded, the biggest issue with data sharing is something that we decided to do ourselves, right? It's GDPR. And I'm all for GDPR. The thing is that it's for personal data originally, right? But it's so easy to tag something as personal data or as sensitive data. So GDPR has been one of the main things that prevents data sharing. And you could even say in terms of mindset, if people think of GDPR, they say, oh, okay, but then it also applies to my data, right? Even though maybe your data, GDPR doesn't apply. So there are many good things in GDPR, but if we think of the balance between privacy and utility for power and energy, we have to be a bit careful because sometimes we have a big loss in terms of what we could do because we want to protect privacy, while actually your privacy is not at stake. I can say so much more about you based on what you post on social media and other things, and CCTV cameras in London, etc., than from your smart metering data. So when people get a bit obsessive with their energy data, actually it's not a big deal compared to so many other things that are shared. So I think it's a bit of a challenge to get people, not just people like us, but all the stakeholders in the energy system, to think that we always have this privacy-utility trade-off, and we have to be careful that privacy doesn't take over on everything. Cool. The thing is that this is recognized, and I'm very happy to see that out there. I have two examples. You have to tell me for the time because I don't have a watch. There are two examples recently. One that was very nice, it's in the UK. I moved to the UK 2 years ago, and the first call that popped out when I arrived there was about AI to help with net zero. And you see, two of the bullet points is how to incentivize customers to share data. And another bullet point is understanding the cost of sharing data, barriers to behavior, etc., which is exactly what I tell you, this balance, utility, privacy, right? So the UK government and funding bodies have actually realized we need to push in this direction. It's not just about tech, it's not just about doing some new ML solution, a bit more complex, a bit more advanced, a bit more whatever you want, interpretable. Actually, we don't care. If people don't share data, we don't care if it's interpretable or not, right? So they've done that. But then industry is also doing that. George and I, we've been interacting with Air Liquide, for instance, this big player in France and internationally, and they realized that. So they advertised this challenge, it was, 2 years ago, where they're ready to put €500,000 on the table for people to develop solutions to help with data sharing and collaborative analytics, right? And someone won the award and is doing work with them to push forward this solution. So now we have governments and we have industry that see it's a big deal, and they're investing in developing solutions, which is really good. So what are politicians doing? They're actually also in the game, and that's very nice to see. Maybe you've heard, but there's many initiatives that push towards having European data spaces. I mentioned Macron before. Macron is also very supportive of that. There's been this thing called Gaia X. There's been this IDS. There's many initiatives also through European projects. Maybe you've heard some energy data spaces projects, etc. I'm not saying that's the solution we should pursue, but at least politicians have been supporting this kind of developments. How are we going to get the data to flow now that we seem to have industry, funding bodies, politicians to support? Maybe people like us support it not too much so far, but still there's quite a bit of momentum. There are some countries that have already started. So I lived in Denmark for a long time, and Denmark has been very good at pushing for that, but in a certain way. Their view is that it has to be centralized. We make this data hub, we collect all the data, we centralize all this data. Is this a good idea? What do you think? Good idea, bad idea, good idea, bad idea? No answer? Yes, I have, yeah, okay. Cool, so it's a very good idea for many reasons. It's also a bad idea because we don't really realize the fact that we have an ecosystem, right? There's no reason, there's a big cost in trying to centralize all the data. There's some easiness maybe in having simple APIs with this central database, but we actually think of it in terms of an innovation ecosystem. Actually, we're trying to have it a bit more to centralize to let this ecosystem flourish by itself, in a more organic manner. So Spain, Estonia, Norway are following this model. There are many things that are good consequences of this. But I would argue there's also a lot of negative because we follow a traditional scheme with energy system to overlook the fact they are more distributed now, right? So some others, they say we do the opposite. We do the decentralized approach, a completely distributed ecosystem, and that's this energy data X that was announced, I think, 6 months ago that Germany wants to push for based on this Gaia X, also a data ecosystem. And then the idea is that, we all see ourselves as data sources, and we have these kind of platforms on the way, right? So there are brokers, there are service providers, there's data as a service, analytics as a service, many things you may want to do. I think it's a very good principle. The problem is quite more work. You need a lot of standards, you need a lot of way to make it happen. I'm not saying I'm pro one or the other, both have plus and minuses, but at least it seems to be happening, right? So the last slide, I hope I have enough time. It's about how we're going to organize it for business models. And so it's smart for us, this EU project that was led by George Kainiotakis here. We've been looking at different type of markets. And I'm not calling them markets as it has to be about the money, but we want to have some kind of incentive framework for people to share their data. So we've been looking at, so this would be typically federated learning, right? Collaborative analytics with some kind of privacy preserving layer. We've been looking at analytics market, so I set up a regression problem, and I'm ready to pay you for your features if you help me to get a better RMSE, for instance. We could have pure data markets, so you have data, I just pay per, volumetric basis or data quality basis. And then there are prediction markets that already exist for politics, for some other application, where people can just make bets, You ask people to predict for you, for instance. They make a bet, they place their forecast, they make their bet, and then you have a way to improve the forecast and to redistribute the money. Just to say there are lots of business models, all right? So to conclude, I just want to say, I use the word hottest, I shouldn't, but it's a very important topic, data sharing. I think many people are in the game. I mentioned, industry, politicians, funding bodies. I think it's great. There's so much potential to develop solutions that are cheaper and easier to access. There's a push for more open source in power and energy. I think it can only be good. But there's a lot of issues also to look at regulation. I mentioned GDPR. It's not the only piece of regulation that may be a problem. And we need also very good use cases. So if you have any idea of use cases with data sharing or collaborative analytics, I think you should reach out to some academic friends and work on that together. Thank you. Are there some questions?
Hi, thank you for your speech, very interesting. Quick question, do you think that something like public funding could help to create like a data market and data monetization for like the energy company to share their data? Or do you think it's better if they do them like for free just to improve and to help the environment?
Yeah, but so that's a very good question. So it's not just a matter of funding. I think it's a matter of how the public institution, the public sector supports that. And we have a parallel with the electricity market. When they started the electricity market, they asked system operator to take care of that. And then when it seems to work, we spin it off, right? And now it's independent. I think it's a bit of the same here. The data hub in Denmark, it has to be an Energinet, the system operator, to build that and pay for it, etc. Right? But now that's going to work, I'm sure there's going to spin it off. So it's exactly what you said. You use public funding to get it to start, because the upfront investment is huge, right? And it has to come with some other things around it, not just the money to develop the thing, but creating the momentum, getting the stakeholders to go together. Also the trust for why it's being built. If it's pushed by the public sector, maybe stakeholders feel it's a fair level playing field, right? So there's trust. If it's me, I make a company, I develop it, I have my own interest, right? So I think it's a very good question, and it should happen this way. You had a question? I think you need the microphone.
Yeah, I think what the colleagues, I think he was more thinking in terms of a decentralized market, as in the US, for example, for patient data, because it's such a decentralized situation. There are now startups coming up who basically pay the people for giving their health data.
Yeah.
And here you could do the same thing. You could say, if you are, as an individual, if you're ready to share your electricity consumption whatsoever, you get a discount on the energy cost, for example.
Yeah, so that's one of the business models that's being discussed in the UK, for instance. I think so here it's some specific type of data. If we think of the final customer, when I was answering this question, I was thinking more also all the asset data. So if you want wind farm own operators, if you want some other asset operators to share data, that's how I was answering. But when it goes to the final consumers, I think there's a lot of these business models where it would be much more decentralized because each retailer may decide. But the problem is the retailers need to see a very nice use case. We've been looking at cases where they would bring that into their energy procurement, so they have better forecasts to trade in the market, right? And still there, it's quite complicated for many of these retailers to implement this kind of system. But the business model, though, is not very difficult because this rebate for sharing data is quite simple to implement, right? Thanks very much.